For decades, Americans treated JFK's assassination as the single defining event of the Kennedy saga. Newly declassified files and 21st-century medical reviews have reopened every corner of the story, showing that the truth never stood still. Looking back in 2025, the assassination didn't end the narrative, it forced a rewrite. Sealed medical records, hidden Cold War concessions, and decades of rumors reshaped how the family was remembered, creating more mysteries than they resolved. The Kennedys became a dynasty not through perfection, but because flaws, secrecy, and spectacle turned into legend. We'll start with the money, because the empire behind the name still hides its receipts. Joseph Sr., the empire behind the curtain. How did the son of a Boston bartender become the architect of one of America's most famous dynasties? The path ran through Joseph Patrick Kennedy, a man who built his fortune less by pedigree than by an unflinching instinct for advantage. His rise was not about noble birth or natural glamour. It came instead from watching where rules bent, where money pooled, and where ambition could be disguised as respectability. One generation out of poverty, he set himself on course to buy permanence with wealth. And when legitimacy seemed just out of reach, he looked to manufacture it through family and public power. The Kennedy legend began not on a convention stage, but in smoke-filled boardrooms, film studios, and markets made chaotic by national prohibition. Kennedy's first major break came on Wall Street in the roaring 1920s. He played the market less like a long-term investor and more like a tactician. Speculation, timing, and moving faster than regulators defined his strategy. For the son of Patrick Kennedy, a man who had poured beer behind the counter in working-class Boston, each trade was more than profit. It was an escape ladder. Money promised an opening into circles that had long locked Irish Catholics out. It bought houses, access, and for a time, the illusion of full respectability. From there, Kennedy widened his range. Hollywood in the late 19-teens and 20s was unsteady but brimming with cash. Studios rose and collapsed quickly, fortunes were lost overnight, and reputations fell even faster. Kennedy moved in as a financier, supplying capital, lending money, and reaping returns from an industry that thrived on attention. More than profit, the film world gave him a new tool, stagecraft. He saw how carefully tailored illusions swayed audiences, how appearances could displace substance. It was a lesson that would one day serve the family's political theater almost as much as its balance sheets. Then came Prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, alcohol vanished publicly but flowed privately. Here, Kennedy again recognized opportunity. By the final years of the ban, he had organized legitimate liquor import businesses and positioned himself so that when repeal came, he stood ready to dominate distribution. The timing was perfect and deeply lucrative. It also fed rumors that refused to die. Some claimed he had leveraged the bootlegging networks that flourished through the 1920s. Others insisted his fortune relied on hidden mob partners. This is where the facts must be separated from the haze. He became the founding chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission in 1934. He later chaired the Maritime Commission, overseeing major U.S. shipping policy. He built lucrative importing ventures, immediately following Prohibition's repeal. Some Mafia figures later suggested they worked with Kennedy in the liquor trade, but professional historians emphasize that such claims remain oral testimony, unproven, and often contradictory. What is clear is that Kennedy built legitimate wealth, and what is equally clear is that allegations of shadow dealings clung tightly to his name, whether confirmed or not. As his fortune solidified, Kennedy turned toward politics. He purchased estates, courted alliances, and looked for positions that could translate wealth into durable influence. His appointments offered credibility. He was chosen by Franklin Roosevelt as ambassador to the United Kingdom in 1938. London, however, proved a stage he could not master. The European crisis demanded clarity of moral stance, but Kennedy's instincts leaned toward caution and appeasement. He believed Britain could not withstand Hitler and preferred a negotiated settlement. He said so bluntly, too bluntly for the British government, which monitored his comments closely. Reports from MI5 at the time noted their unease with his neutrality, and the press bristled at remarks that seemed to undercut Allied determination. Within the Roosevelt administration, colleagues fumed at his habit of freelancing opinions out of step with official policy. The inevitable end came in 1940. Amid suspicion in London and exasperation in Washington, Kennedy was recalled from his post. Though not advertised as scandal, the quiet removal carried humiliation all the same. Newspaper coverage and diplomatic gossip made his position untenable. For a man who had expected the ambassadorship to crown his career, the experience instead drew a line under his personal ambition. Embarrassed by diplomatic failure, Joe switched from personal conquest to constructing a political dynasty through money and sons. The disappointment in London convinced him that the Kennedy name could never achieve full acceptance through him alone. Instead, he could invest fortunes and strategy into the careers of his children, molding them into the respectable and successful figures that he, with shadows at his back, could not convincingly portray. That pivot proved decisive. Each Kennedy campaign in the decades to come grew from networks that Joe SR financed, contacts he cultivated, and lessons drawn from his own reversals. In this sense, the ambition that faltered in London seeded something larger than personal advancement. It seeded a dynasty. His failure abroad became the foundation stone of his family's domestic rise. Yet the Kennedy mystique was never able to escape that aura of uncertainty. Scholars reviewing Joe SR's financial record still debate how much of his fortune derived strictly from legitimate ventures like Wall Street manipulation and liquor importing, and how much leaned on questionable or undocumented deals. The lack of clarity only deepened fascination. Wealthy American families often tie their legacies to oil, railroads, or manufacturing, sectors with paperwork trails and measurable accounting. The Kennedy fortune seemed instead to shift between documented profit and rumored connections. That half-seen quality introduced drama. It felt like half biography, half legend. The uncertainty proved as powerful a branding tool as any campaign slogan. Whispers about organized crime, speculations about corporate opportunism, and debates about who financed what during Prohibition never fully faded from the Kennedy orbit. What they provided was atmosphere, a sense of secrecy that wrapped around family photographs and political speeches alike. The dynasty stood as much on unanswered questions as on bank statements. Without that duality, fascination might not have lasted. A family built simply on clean profits and clean reputations might have merged into the background with dozens of other American dynasties. Instead, the Kennedys carried mystique. Americans sensed that behind the public sheen there lingered other stories, half-hidden, unexplained, or deliberately obscured. The secrecy itself became an active component of their power, magnifying their allure while leaving open the space for conspiracy, suspicion, and endless reinterpretation. By the 1950s, this mixture of visible respectability and invisible shadows had seasoned into myth. Every silence invited speculation. Every detail left unresolved encouraged theories that multiplied. The father had shown one path: ambition, cunning, and a willingness to bend rules. The sons inherited not only the financial resources, but also the fog that surrounded its origin. That fog never lifted. Later rumors about mob contacts, about wartime neutrality, about questionable alliances with industrialists all circled back to the elder Kennedy's appetite for power. These traces turned Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. into a man both respected and distrusted, a figure whose triumphs were undeniable, but whose legacy refused to be written without footnotes and doubts. When his children stepped onto the political stage, they did so carrying both the fortune and the uncertainty that surrounded it. Their father's secrecy seeped forward, shaping the way Americans consumed the Kennedy story. The Camelot image that would later grip the nation did not rise from clean origins. It stood on ground part solid and part shadowed, always subject to re-examination. And from those shadows, a new paradox emerged. Even as the family projected energy and vigor, stories beneath the surface hinted at frailty, hidden struggles, and private truths that could not be displayed in public. That paradox waited, ready to challenge the polished images Americans would soon see from the Kennedy son. Building Camelot on a doctor's note. John F. Kennedy wore the look of a golden figure, but his medical record tells another story. On campaign stages and in newsreels, he was the picture of vigor, tanned, athletic, with an easy stride. Behind closed doors, though, he lived with a body that demanded constant medical care simply to maintain the image of health. Diagnosed in 1947 with adrenal insufficiency, often described as Addison's disease, he required daily corticosteroids to compensate for what his body could not provide. Years of spinal injury added another burden. His first major surgery came in 1944, and more followed in the 1950s, leaving him with chronic spinal pain and a dependence on stiff back braces. By the time he entered the White House, this youthful president carried an invisible weight that shaped both his days and his decisions. The dissonance was striking. Cameras framed him as the most energetic leader in a generation, yet away from the lens, doctors supplied him with a rotation of drugs, painkillers, stimulants, sedatives, while carefully watching his stamina. Even his walk, slightly rigid at times, gave only the faintest hint of the back surgeries that had left his spine unstable and his mobility fragile. Conversations with aides or family sometimes paused to allow for injections or to counter waves of fatigue. The celebrated image was not false exactly, but it was curated, timed to match the window in which his body could withstand the strain. These struggles had been with him since long before the presidency. Twice in his youth, he was administered the Catholic last rites, his frailty so apparent to those around him that survival seemed uncertain. Yet somehow he recovered and persisted, carrying not the resilience of perfect health, but a reliance on relentless medical maintenance. Aides who traveled with him saw the routines. Trays of pills, doctor consultations as a near-daily event, the president moving through each day propped by what one staffer privately called medical scaffolding. Policy did not exist apart from these realities. His staff understood that Kennedy's focus came in intervals. Cabinet discussions and crisis briefings sometimes had to be set within specific hours before exhaustion overtook him. Medical notes and schedule reconstructions reviewed decades later reveal a pattern of constrained windows of optimal working time, punctuated by treatments to relieve back pain or offset the drag of adrenal insufficiency. Privately, the most powerful man in the world had to ration his hours like a patient, pacing through a demanding regimen. The official line, however, offered none of this. Kennedy and his team, from campaign through presidency, concealed the full extent of his conditions as if protecting classified information. Every snapshot publicized strength. Hospital admissions were disguised, and photographers who happened upon candid signs of weakness had their images destroyed or withheld. This secrecy was not merely vanity, it was strategic. At the height of the Cold War, when Joe Khrushchev was seeking leverage, a president revealed as chronically ill could have fueled the perception of national vulnerability. Containment required more than missiles and speeches. It required projecting the illusion of unshakable command. But concealment carried its own consequences. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963 and fragments of his medical record surfaced in later years, the hidden illnesses stoked suspicion. If this central truth had been withheld so effectively, what else might have been hidden? The gap between the public image and private reality did not fade with his death. It became fuel for decades of conspiracy and distrust, as secrecy itself felt like evidence of broader deception. Compared to today's standards, the strategy is almost unimaginable. Voter polls in 2025 show strong majorities demanding the full release of medical records from presidential candidates. Transparency has become an expectation. Yet in the 1960s, before the modern 24-hour press cycle and health disclosures, concealing serious illness was treated as necessary statecraft. The calculation of Kennedy's circle was simple. Truth would weaken him, lies could sustain him. The wellness projected on television was never the complete man. It was a Cold War performance engineered for stability. That stage management set the tone for his presidency. Appearances of vigor enabled him to address Congress with presence and travel abroad with confidence, even as aides carried extra medications in case he collapsed. His capacity to function as commander-in-chief often hinged on how well doctors had managed his pain on a given morning. The White House clinic, with its whispered scans and hurried injections, became backstage to the visible presidency, allowing the show to continue daily without interruption. Health crises pressed most sharply at moments of international confrontation. A man dependent on injections to remain upright now faced the demands of nuclear brinkmanship. Diplomacy in this setting was not merely about intellect or courage. It required energy to endure the endless meetings, stamina to read extended intelligence reports, and clarity to weigh dangerous choices under fatigue. The limits of his body became folded into the limits of policy, and the secrecy that shielded his health mirrored the secrecy shaping Cold War maneuvering. The episode that revealed this contrast most starkly came in October 1962. While Kennedy's doctors adjusted dosages to keep him functional through long nights, Soviet missiles were discovered in Cuba, and the eyes of the world turned toward Washington. The youthful leader who had built a reputation on vitality now faced the most dangerous confrontation of the century. His health battles remained hidden, but the stakes pressed harder than ever. His body wavered, even as his image had to radiate steady resolve. The story of Camelot was crafted from his charm, vision, and composure. Yet beneath the shine ran the quieter reality of chronic fragility, Addison's disease requiring steroids, a spine carved by surgeries, dependence on medication, and a habit of secrecy. Those truths make the myth more complex, not less. Kennedy persevered, but he did so through constant medical intervention and deliberate image building. The legend of vigor was in many respects a construction of the Cold War, just as essential to deterrence as the missiles aimed across ocean. And it is that divide between a fragile body and a burnished image that set the stage for his defining crisis. Because when the confrontation in Cuba began, Kennedy did not face it as the effortless golden boy America imagined. He faced it as a man carrying intense pain, high doses of medication, and adrenal insufficiency that left him one misstep away from collapse. That physical fragility matters when the world goes nuclear. Coming next, Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis. New files, new fears. For decades, the Cuban Missile Crisis was presented as Kennedy's moment of ultimate triumph. But newly opened files complicate that portrait. The narrative once framed him as a leader who stared down Moscow with steady nerve, but the records show a more precarious truth. Luck, secrecy, and compromise weighed just as heavily as resolve. In October 1962, an abstract Cold War turned immediate and tangible, its shadow condensing into an emergency that ran across 13 days when nuclear war looked frighteningly possible. The relief Americans celebrated when it ended masked just how narrow and fragile the escape had actually been. Newly declassified Soviet and Russian archive material makes the story even more untidy. The missile deployment in Cuba, long taught as a bold Soviet escalation, was in part Moscow's counterbalance to American Jupiter missiles already stationed in Turkey. Inside the White House, Kennedy formed an executive committee, or ExComm, meeting each day to deliberate. Their debates swayed between extremes. Some demanded immediate airstrikes to eliminate the missiles. Others pointed out that striking first could unleash a war no one could contain. The tone captured in tapes was not that of calm chess masters, but officials talking in circles, anxious to prevent disaster without knowing the full extent of what they faced. The committee did not realize that by mid-October, several dozen Soviet nuclear warheads were already operational in Cuba. Local commanders had standing orders that would have allowed their use if attacked. A preemptive strike, then, would likely have set off nuclear detonations on the island. Only later did intelligence confirm how close the United States had been to stumbling into escalation. Decisions were being made in Washington on incomplete assessments, with the risk of catastrophe unknown even to those holding the levers. Kennedy publicly opted for a naval quarantine around Cuba, framing it as a measured step short of war. But what remained hidden for decades was his private concession. Through back channels, he secretly agreed that the United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey as part of the settlement, provided that arrangement stayed off the record. Publicly, the United States forced Moscow to yield. Privately, Kennedy paid with something significant, shielding the deal from both American voters and NATO partners who had relied on those weapons. The secrecy mattered as much as the settlement itself. Revealing to Congress or the public that American missiles in Turkey had been bargained away would have been politically explosive. Kennedy's image rested on resolve, not compromise. Allies required reassurance that the U.S. would not cut deals behind their backs, so the removal had to be handled quietly, disguised as a scheduled modernization rather than a retreat extracted under pressure. When documents decades later exposed the bargain, historians came to understand how central those hidden withdrawals had been in ending the crisis. The drama in both Havana and Washington often tilted toward absurdity. Khrushchev sent a conciliatory letter proposing terms one evening, only to follow up with a harsher message the next day. Kennedy chose to ignore the second, responding only to the first. Public rhetoric, private bargaining, and military preparations all played out in awkward synchronization. It was a negotiation carried on through contradictions, with each side juggling audiences at home and abroad while trying to keep events from sliding into war. Later documentaries polished the facts into a clean narrative. The raw tapes and documents, now available, reveal unease, improvisation, and leaders groping for exits from a darkening tunnel. What emerged was a resolution that boosted Kennedy's popularity. Newspapers heralded him as the man who stood firm and forced Khrushchev back. His reputation as a cool navigator of nuclear brinkmanship was secured in American memory. But archival records reveal an administration improvising under immense strain, balancing pressure from military chiefs lusting for action with diplomatic messages urging caution. The myth of confident mastery endured, while the messy truth, a scramble toward compromise, remained hidden. The release of Soviet records also disrupts the narrative of pure American strength. Logistical chaos on the Soviet side undermined the neat version of Kennedy as sole victor. Shipments had been disorganized, communication with Moscow unreliable, command structures uncertain. Khrushchev's retreat owed as much to internal strain and fear of unintended escalation as it did to Kennedy's resolve. The picture becomes less about a single leader bending another to his will, and more about two sides stumbling toward survival in an environment of mutual miscalculation. Secrecy and image control formed the backbone of the outcome. Kennedy needed to project resilience abroad and strength at home. Publicly admitting that he had conceded missiles would have fractured confidence, fueled domestic critics, and emboldened rivals. The controlled stagecraft of the White House, therefore, was as vital as naval patrols. On stage, a president spoke calmly of protecting peace. Behind the curtain, he compromised, worried, and relied on back channels his supporters would never hear about. Historians now stress an essential point. The world avoided war not because the path was clear, but because both sides, by chance and choice, stepped away before momentum carried them over. Declassified files underline how close timing came to spiraling out of control. Even a minor accident at sea or an undetected order on the island could have pushed events further. The outcome that history later called Kennedy's finest hour was in fact precarious survival. The long-term fascination lies in this dual image. To the public, a youthful president weathered the ultimate Cold War trial and emerged as guarantor of peace. Within the records, a fragile figure navigated half information, suppressed concessions, and domestic calculations too brittle to expose.